Trustees of the Geoffrey Bawa Trust, I'd like to welcome you to the 9th annual Geoffrey Bawa Memorial Lecture, and thank you all for coming. Today we commemorate the 9th death anniversary of Geoffrey's, which falls on the 27th of May, that's on Sunday, but the lecture the last few years has been happening on the closest Friday to his death anniversary, so this time it's today. And thank you all very much for coming for it. If any of you ever wondered what would happen if the architecture of Geoffrey Bawa and the Australian architect Glenn Murcutt were to meet and sort of coalesce of some sort, then perhaps you're in for a treat this evening. Having had an almost life-changing meeting with Geoffrey in 1996, which was partly what put him on his current career path, Bijoy Jain, the speaker this evening, has made making a synthesis of the work of these two people, whose architecture he admired so much, part of his life's work. But this is not just done in any old way, but is done with a clearly thought-out manner, always working with artisans and craftsmen, striving to achieve the meticulous precision of thought in every detail that goes into Murcutt's work, to surround spaces that relate to the landscape and to each other in what you see in the built forms, and to the landscape and the context in which it is built, with the sensuality and elegance that we all associate with Geoffrey's work. As he said to me over lunch today, the inbuilt error that seems to rise out of working with craftsmen and people like that in making architecture and making artifacts that he does is something that he enjoyed very much. This, I may add, is perhaps opposed to the precision and coldness of some of the factory-produced buildings that we see in a lot of architectural practice today. This error is much like the Islamic practice of Islamic artisans, leaving a tiny, small error of a carpet in a part of a carpet as an imperfection because of the notion that only God could be perfect. It is this ability to celebrate the human hand in his work and the work of his studio that I, for one, most admire in his work. But let me not decide for you. I'll let you decide for yourself. So I present to you, to deliver the 9th Geoffrey Bawa Memorial Lecture, Mr. Bijoy Jain.
Channa, thank you for the introduction. It's a real honor and privilege to be standing here. I could never imagine that this opportunity would come my way. And I'm very thankful for having the possibility of engaging in this way. Channa mentioned that I'd met Mr. Bawa in 1996. I've been to Sri Lanka several times from the 70s. And I had the good fortune, we were staying at the villa, 4 friends, and I was told that Mr. Bawa was going to be visiting, so I anxiously woke up that morning in anticipation of his visit. And he arrived at 10, and I met him at the front door of the villa and introduced myself. I'm an architect, and at that point in time, Mr. Bawa was working on a project for my wife's sister, and so I just sort of introduced 3 other friends of mine who had nothing to do with architecture. And while I was standing there, he had barely got out of his car and looked at the gate posts that were being built, and sort of, asked me, what do you think of the proportion? And that completely, took me by surprise, and I kind of mumbled, jumbled, trying not to commit because I had absolutely no idea, how to look at it. And then, as we continued to speak, a friend of mine who was unabashed, not knowing who Mr. Bawa was, just barraged him with several questions about the villa and the way it was, and he sort of was amused actually, and we were fortunate to be invited to Lunuganga later that evening for tea and cakes. Now, what was interesting was I actually had very long hair that morning. And then we arrived at 4 in the afternoon at Lunaganga, and I had, at that point, between the days, shaved all my hair. So it was a sort of a surprise, but a sort of interesting situation. Anyway, over tea and cakes, conversation continued, and of course I was very familiar with Lunaganga and the whole project, the trees. I'd studied the plans over the years, and so I said I'd sort of take a small, walk, because now I could see the real thing and be as part of the real thing. And barely did I walk 10 minutes. So I was struck with the beauty in a way that I wasn't able to actually see the entire project. It was so overwhelming that I actually sat down and took a rest and decided not to see the rest of Lunaganga, because what I'd seen was enough, and would leave it for some other time. And we were very fortunate to have some time over the last 2 days. Anyway, I came back and we continued to speak, and it was a sort of very special moment, like few drops of, honey drops that fall from the sky in a sense. And Mr. Bawa, we walked towards the front door of the house, and then he gestured, looking at the far view at the, down the lake, and then the stupa at the far end, and said that, it's a continuous battle between architecture, the view, and the landscape. And I didn't quite understand. I mean, I soaked that in and sort of took that little sentence and put it in my pocket. And then there was another one also that he talked about and said it's, a lot about the landscape and the relationship of the landscape. And that the building is secondary to the landscape. And this idea of, too much architecture between me and the view. And these sort of two very specific sentences, caught my attention. But what more importantly was, it was the beginning of a journey. It was a sort of a moment where I decided to, in some way, emulate the kind of practice and the kind of, freedom and passion that he addressed the architecture. And also just in terms of understanding landscape, because as an architect, you're trained to think about architecture, bricks and mortar and all of that. And I decided when I went back to India that I would start exploring this idea of the landscape, beginning to learn how to observe the trees, the shape, the space, the qualities in the seasons, and it became a sort of rigorous exercise. And I said that if Mr. Bawa did it, I should also practice and learn from this. And what we did was actually set up a studio and a workshop in Alibag. It's on the mainland. It's about a 40-minute boat ride from Mumbai across onto the mainland India. And it's like sort of driving from Colombo to Galle. And we set up, it's sort of a rural area 16 years ago. And when I reflect back and think about it, it was really the turning point. It was the moment where something was unfolding. And I was also trying to find a place in India to sort of find a place of how could I practice as an architect. It was very difficult. India is a fast-paced, economically developing. The kind of buildings that were coming up were not the buildings that I was interested in. So it was more sort of a search, a sort of taking a torchlight in the dark, and that's really how this process began. So anyway, I'll talk more about the studio. Our studio is primarily, we started with 7 artisans and myself in '96. And that now has grown to about 100, 120 people, and we have about 13 or 14 architects. But what more importantly is that they actually participate in a way that is more intuitive. It's sort of a tacit knowledge. We're a studio that is, in a sense, set in medieval times, like the way architecture was built, I would say, in Sri Lanka or India or in Europe, a few hundred years ago, and actually not that long ago. So this is just a visual of the studio where, a lot of the work is done through gestures, storytelling, full-scale mock-ups, drawings, and also this idea of, cultures. I'm Indian, was born in the 60s, grew up with, listening to Doors and Jim Morrison and Deep Purple and Levi's jeans, as well as my mother was a classical musician, so we had that at home. So this was a sort of mixture, I would say, that I grew up, and And then I have these artisans, who have come from a traditional background, some from Rajasthan, Orissa, Bihar, and they practice a culture that is, that has been passed on from generations. And so what for me was important was how to develop a dialogue. How do we sort of find a place that we can actually meet? We're still Indian. There's something that joins us. But culturally, we're quite different in many ways. So it was sort of this beginning, this idea of the possibility of making architecture through storytelling, through memory. And so anyway, I'm going to continue. So this is a workshop. Some more slides, some more images of just the space, and a lot of the work is produced through making models. We found that this was the best way to communicate. I guess drawings, models, paintings, objects, anything as a means of communication, tools of communication. But what was interesting was that this was universal. The language was quite universal, and it allowed several people to participate at the same time. So what I'm showing you basically are working drawings. These are conceptual models. These are artisans who are actually participating in the making, in the concept. We can discuss, ideas of space through thickness, density, mass, and they intuitively get it. I mean, there's a sort of intuitive, innate, tacit understanding of this. And what we also found was that it was faster for us to do a full-scale cross-sectional mock-up than actually make a drawing. And that way we could actually stand underneath the space, look at it, and actually participate. It would allow the client to participate. And so I'm just sort of, setting up what is the nature of our practice. Is it possible to reduce some of the slide that's... Okay. This slide, what I like about it is this idea of postures in architecture. And I think, again, very prevalent in this region of the globe, Sri Lanka, India, where we still sit down on the ground. But for me, it's interesting because this idea of, the question that I raise is that do traditions get lost maybe in the loss of postures? That if we lose postures, maybe certain kinds of architecture, certain things cannot be made anymore. Though the materials exist, more than the techniques exist, but it's all about taking a posture in the making of architecture, and also the proximity in which these materials are made. There's a certain sense of a proximity that resonates in the process of making. So again, just sort of to give a brief background of how we've tried to approach what we do and why we do it this way. Again, it's interesting when you see all fours, the hands and the feet all connect in the making of the object, where it's a total complete cycle of hand, body, and mind, all engaged in making this thing. So I sort of stumbled upon this, of course, over several years, just observing. Earlier you just take these things for granted, but later on one begins. It sort of, like an osmosis, sort of seeps into the architecture, and it sort of retains a certain quality. Channa talked about this idea of error, and that's something that I'm very curious about, because I think it's this idea of error through attention, error through the process of making something again and again and again, that you develop an intuitive understanding, and in the process of actually making it at that moment is when it all matters. And it's not really an error that comes out of being lackadaisical or being inattentive, but it comes out of a sort of very clear, precise understanding of that relationship. And I think that's where then the architecture can resonate. Again, just drawings. I normally would draw with a red pen, axonometrics, and these are our working drawings. And that's how we discuss any decision. A minimum of 3 people are involved in making a decision. That's my head carpenter, was quite young at that time, but sort of shamanic in a way. He had a sort of, they could call upon sort of ideas and thoughts and details that they'd never done. I mean, I remember him talking to me that, I wish I had paid more attention when my grandfather and father were teaching us, and this was at the age of 13, where he talked about the things that we're talking about, and he said, I never realized that these things would be of value today. But interestingly, somewhere, somehow, they're able to reach, I would say, deep down into their belly, just by the environment that they lived in. And they're able to draw these conditions out, these sensations out. But this is just drawings that they have learned on their own, that they use. Normally for a project, we have a sort of very basic plan and a cross-section with some broad dimensions. But most of the work is actually done through memory and making some physical registrations on site. Anyway, I'll start with one of the projects. This is a house, it's in Alibag. And what we found was this sort of hole in the ground. It's about 50 meters, a little less than 50 meters from the sea, and it was a house, a fairly large house for a family, like 3 generations that would live in this house. And this was an excavation that existed, and we decided to keep it as the sort of focus because it really was a well, an artisanal, or a cistern that harnessed sweet water, and you had the sweet water layer sort of resting above the salt water. So that's a meeting with our consultant, an 82-year-old gentleman. You can see the crutches, and he pretty much lost his life at 18, actually fell into the well while constructing, when he was young, as an apprentice, but then spent most of his life, in this in the discipline of just well making. So we consulted him. He's a local gentleman. And again, you can see just this idea of gestures. I was completely clueless. So I really had to depend on local knowledge. Yes, I had a trained degree, but not with the sort of sensitivity that I found, in abundance. I think what's interesting is that when one thinks about India, and even traditional India, most of the architecture was built without architects, and there's some wonderful architecture. So it was something to think about and something to tap into. So that's the community that's engaged in building the well. He's supervising the well. There were some very broad drawings done. Actually, this drawing was done after we built the well. And the whole idea was that it formed the belly button, I would say, the belly button of the project. It sort of formed the center. And the whole house was sort of wrapped around the belly button as a gesture, in a sense, protecting the sort of center, which was the source of water, a source of life for the house. And in many ways, the house sort of imploded or exploded out from this particular space. So the reason I'm showing it to you this way is this is how I imagined the house actually emerging. And that really formed the core of the project. At some point in time, the house would disintegrate. But what would still remain is the core value, or the sort of the phenomena of the site, which would then enable, again, a reconstruction, maybe in a different way, but this would still remain as a center or as a source of life. So this is a photograph taken in the monsoon, and you can see it's high water. And then this is in the summertime. But also you can see the slide on the right, or the picture on the right, that there's a watermark that's left, and that was a few hours earlier where it registered the high tide or the low tide. That was a high tide. So in a sense, this was an organ which was living and breathing. It actually, registered time, talked about the cycles of the moon. And I didn't anticipate or expect this. And what was wonderful was actually, in a sense, the senses, the visual senses that we are so attuned to in architecture, were actually compromised. And in many ways, being in such close proximity to the sea, the sense of the ocean was heightened. It's like taking a conch shell and putting it to your ear, and you hear the sort of ocean sounds. And that was the same kind of quality inside the space. But also, again, it sort of tapped into this idea of an ebb and flow that happens in India, of the moon cycle. India still functions on a moon cycle or a moon time, where you see exodus of people going back to the villages for farming during the monsoon. Festivals are based on the moon. And so it was sort of a phenomena that I discovered. It wasn't intentional, but just sort of interesting for me to observe that when one of the senses is taken away, you can actually heighten an experience that I never thought about in the making of architecture. So anyway, let me forward. And that's the plan. It's sort of, there's a big courtyard in the middle. All the roofs basically take the water, the rainwater, and drop them down into the courtyard, and then that percolates through the plants and goes down to through these holes that you see on the right, and percolate back into the well. So it's this whole idea of regeneration or recycling. Again, not so much with this idea of sustainability, but I think it's just central core. It's a core value for that place. Rooms are arranged around the family, so different parts of the family occupy different spaces, and the black space in between is where they come and meet. So yeah, that's... What was interesting, since it was a large house, we developed the plaster for this. And again, we built most of our projects right from foundation up. We developed the plaster, the color, sourced the wood. And this is a sort of graphite color that actually mimicked the shadows that we found under the roof. And so we actually decided, through that, in the process of building the project, one was anticipating it to be white or off-white, and it didn't seem appropriate. And then one observed the shadow under the roof, and that was the right solution. And that's the plaster that mimics the graphite mimics the shadow. And what's interesting is it actually reflects back the landscape into the architecture. Again, for example, we have an abundance of light. So this idea of thickness, density, mass of light was sort of very interesting for us. And again, this idea of views, cross views, being obscured by the vegetation, all that was very much a part of how this plan was perceived. This is a project, again, on the same coastline. A client who was a writer, and he wanted to write a book and commissioned us, and found this sort of very dense coconut plantation. And I think the only reason he purchased this plot of land was the fact that it was in close proximity to the ocean. But what was interesting for us was the quality of the canopy that covered the site. It was quite unique. And what was difficult was that there was no typology that I was aware of where architecture in a very dense plantation, a coconut plantation, existed. Normally one would make a clearing and then build a project within that. And so we decided that is it possible in some way to retain these trees and not worry about the ocean. The ocean became a sort of secondary condition to the site. And that you can see the density of the trees. So it was like this colonnade of, it was a colonnade with the canopy. And in some ways, light, the sunlight was naturally taken care of. And so what we did was actually, visiting the site again and again and again. And what I like is it's like a relationship. That by visiting a site, you often begin to, there's an evolution, there's an understanding that occurs over a period of time. Much in the same way that you'd meet a friend, cousin, girlfriend, wife, whatever. There's a time that's involved. And the model here was really a working drawing. We made these models. They're fairly accurate. The carpenters make them pretty precisely, and then the dimensions are written, and they would actually measure. So we had a tolerance of, I think, between 6 and 12 millimeters. That's it. And then you can see on the slide above, it's basically a full-scale mock-up using the existing old trees, the old areca nut or betel nut trees, and we framed the sort of box. Now, my carpenters are primarily cabinet makers from Rajasthan, and so when I suggested that we're going to do this, they said there's no way we can do this. And then I said, okay, let's look at it that you're just making a box that's 70 feet by 12 feet by 20 feet, and they all nodded their heads saying, yes, 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 we can do this. I don't know if it happens here in Sri Lanka, but in India, for me, what's interesting is yes and no is the same. You gesture, it's yes, and if you gesture, no, and you're sort of trying to figure out which, what's being said, yes, no, no, yes, and you kind of go between the two. And I think what's nice, I like, is the ambiguity that lies in between this yes and no, yes, no, maybe, and it can move from, through the day. So how does one find a way to work in this? Again, I'm just talking about these are experiences, these are very specific, special moments that have helped us uncover, conditions where we normally get constricted. So it's this idea of unpredictability in the communication also that is very important. These are just what I was talking about, models, very precisely done. So they also become their own entities, their architecture by themselves, without having to really build the whole thing. And they exist as objects unto themselves. And this is what we do, this is what they do, from the initiation of the concept, several things like these are continuously made. And the same people who make these models actually go to site and then construct the building. And they have a way to register the heights, and it's sort of all, it's all done on site, but also a lot through memory and a lot through practice. So this idea of practice, of making these things is very important. Again, inspiration of what we observe, what we see in everyday life. These are betel nut trees that were cut, and I've taken this fence a while ago, before even building this project or even thinking about this project. That's the anti-termite treatment down below that we're doing, which is the local palmyra trunk is being smoked. Sorry. And that's the project. And the whole idea was to sort of slip these boxes, these wooden boxes that suggested, it wasn't conceived. When I first went to site, I'd imagined them to be these glowing lanterns, completely illogical. But that was the sort of inner voice, this idea of a lantern that was suspended in the space. And I quite didn't really know how to get to it. And so it was just this exercise of surveying, making marks. Also, this idea of a hybrid, between the tradition and the development or the sort of industry. So this idea of a hybrid, and Channa talked about Glen Murcutt and Geoffrey Bawa, because what I enjoyed is the romanticism, this idea of space, the seamlessness, the ease in which his projects sort of sit and sort of, just observe the landscape, and I think in a very sort of effortless, easy way, without asking you to commit to something. On the opposite side was Glen Murcutt, that I was also very fascinated by, and just the sheer precision in which he would go about making his buildings, single-handedly, doggedly. And oftentimes I would think that what happened if these two mixed, if these two came together? Was there a possibility of a third? And this was something sort of sitting in the back of my head. Anyway, it was not, I wouldn't say it was conscious, but it was a thought that was there. So part of this dimension actually of these wooden boxes comes from 3 sheets of plywood, which are 4 feet wide, 4 feet by 8 feet, so it makes 12 feet. And then we found this optimum dimension, what might seem as a sort of array of trees without any logic. We found a dimension that resonated and sat comfortably within the space left between the trees. So that's how we actually conceived the project and the dimension for the project. Again, it's basically like a the locals call it a laundry box. They call it a mini bus. It's fascinating. But the whole basis of the project was that it was just a volume of air that was trapped, that was suspended in this wooden frame structure. All the colors, everything was inspired by what was actually on site. They had these beautiful irrigation channels that we continue to have, and that was really the core, again, of the value of this project, where the structures at some point would deteriorate in time in 50, 100 years, and what would still remain is the sort of main spine, which was this irrigation channel. But the colors of the walls were inspired by the lichen on the trees. Again, here what was interesting was this idea of what's inside and outside, and not necessarily that you need to see the outside. And again, for me, a discovery here was, what was interesting was that the atmospheric air that is outside and the air that is inside the building are actually identical. Because there's no glass, there's no screen, it's just these louvers, and it sort of dissipates between the two. So while you're inside, inside a covered space, you still get a sense of a very sort of strong presence of the outside. And when you move between the two, you don't experience the difference. And again, this was, sort of for me, redefining what does inside and outside, or outside is inside, inside. And, we talk a lot about this in what we do. And this was a fascinating experience for me. Again, an accident that I guess in some way also intuitive. As an experience within myself, which was then experienced in this building here. And that's the space. So that's how you enter. And the whole idea of the front door was this water channel, and you'd sort of walk, rushing your hands, running your hands through the water. And there's no door to the project really. There's, it's ambiguous. You come into the central space, and it's a sort of two-sided, infinite. You have the view of the horizon to the sea, and then you have the view of the plantation, to the east. And that was really the space, and you actually crossed over the space continuously. It's sort of like a resonance. If that was zero, you moved between these points, between this point all the time. So we actually distributed the program of living on one side, dining on the other, and then the bedrooms were scattered between the two volumes. But again, it's sort of, there's a suspension, the idea of it being suspended, like a boat being pulled out from the sea. And so these platforms are that receive these sort of wooden frame skeletal structures. And you can see one of them sort of skewed because, not out of intent, but that's what the site allowed us to do. We actually had to go back and make measure drawings. We had, the last year we had to publish some work of ours, and it took us 5 months to go back to a lot of projects and actually measure them fairly accurately and draw them up. Till then, we didn't really have drawings of these projects. Again, just the tests, the experiments, to ensure that no, they're not experiments. They're tested through time. Their engineering is tested, and oftentimes we rely on each other's knowledge. We rely on the physical experience that we see around us in our neighborhoods. And if we are able to span 4 meters, then we accept the 4-meter span, saying that we have confidence and we have the ability. And we believe that good architecture or space can be produced with that limitation. So this idea of also being limited in many ways for us actually works to an advantage, because this way we have the ability and the control, and we don't need to depend on an outside source. Yes, we do get it checked by the engineer once we have conceived it, developed it, just to get his nod off, his sign off, but to actually take full responsibility for the project in every single way. We also maintain these buildings. This one is now 6-7 years old, and we go back every year and look after these buildings. So it's a process of care also that's very important as part of what we do. And that's what I mean by the studies. These were the studies, this was the drive to the site, and at one point I discovered that maybe did the project come from here? And then at one point we stopped and actually measured the space, and it was actually quite close to what we had built. Even there's different doors, which I very much enjoyed, rather than everything lining up. So these were things, this idea of osmosis in architecture, the idea of osmosis of learning, of osmosis through time and familiarity. It was important, again, very important for us is that the architecture in some way is familiar, or there's some familiarity for the people that are building, but at the same time, there's a space that they're not familiar with. And it's in that familiarity that they're able to engage. And through engaging slowly, there's a discovery, of how this unpredictable, unfamiliar space is opened up. And I think for us, what's important is it's not a point where I draw them towards me or they draw me towards them. We're constantly working with each other to find a third space, that we're not familiar with, and to anticipate the building in a way that we still quite don't know. We can sense it, but we don't know accurately what exactly is going to occur once it is completed. So that is very much part of an exercise that we continuously maintain in the practice. And that's the image of this idea of lanterns, where it would actually dissipate light in the evening, would dissipate from inside the house onto the landscape, cast light on the coconut trees, cast light on the ground, and that's how, some way, in a very hazy way, I imagined seeing the project. This is another house. It's on a barren plateau, again in Alibag. And you can see this was sort of a deforestation that had taken place over a period of time in the last 60, 70 years. And fundamentally what this is a courtyard house. Rather than build boundary walls, stone boundary walls, we built these sort of 4 walls that made an enclosure. We set it down in the ground by 4 feet, and then at the section it came back flush with the ground. And the whole basis of this was actually to try and retain or slow down the water in a way that it would begin to regenerate the plants that had once been taken away. So again, the whole idea is that the landscape becomes the core value. The landscape, the way it meets the ground, the way the building meets the ground is really the core value. And for me, really the project that's for me the project. Everything else was program and function and sleeping spaces. But effectively there are 4 walls, and on these 4 walls there are these lightweight pavilions that sit on these walls and make an enclosure. These are photographs that were taken, I think, now 5 years ago. It's quite lush and green. And again, Mr. Bawa's idea of this battle between landscape and man, or nature and man, I would call it battle, but it's a relationship, I think would be more accurate, and one which you have to participate. Because if you don't participate, the forces of nature are so strong that they would eventually come and take over. So it's a question of how much you colonize, how much you leave, how much you keep. And I found that, as a very important exercise, this idea of, how do we engage with what surrounds us? And how sensitively do we engage with what surrounds us? So this project is really about that idea of, setting it in the ground. And if one doesn't take too much care, this idea of the landscape slowly inside the house. At this point, I was trying this idea of case study houses, the Los Angeles Schindler and Neutra, and to think about the appropriateness in our climate, because it's tropical and you can have these open spaces. But anyway, you can see the sort of gestures of that. And again, these sort of just details that are very specific to our studio. We are able to make a lot of these things within the studio. So all the fittings, specifically, very much in the way that I think architecture is practiced and has been made out here. That's, part of the inspiration that led us to do these kinds of things. And you can see that that's the outside and the inside and the difference in the quality of the landscape. This is an urban project. This is actually the city in Mumbai. It was an existing house, and we had to sort of reorient the house because the land that the house sat on had been subdivided. So the entire orientation of the house had to be reconfigured. And then we had to add another extra space on the top of what was ground plus 1. So this is the part that faces the street, and we basically gutted out and kept the existing concrete frame, tore half the house down. But what it effectively does is basically takes advantage of the landscape on 3 sides, and the 4th one being the road. We had this sort of wooden slatted screen, much like a wooden trellis, which in time would get, which would act like a curtain, a wind chime, if you want to call it, sort of having these kinds of suggestions, but also a privacy and a protection screen. Again, this project we constructed from scratch, and all the handles, the screen details. That's the mock-up. We're testing the staircase and jumping on it on the right-hand corner to check for strength. Door details of how they would open and shut. Handrails, and these really become the tools. These become what are leftover artifacts for us that become part of the archive of the project. That's the project and. Again, very simple materials. This local Kota stone, it's timber and brass, and this idea of materials that endure and weather through time become very critical for us because there's a sense of personality and a patina that is gained in this. Yeah. And I think also sometimes it's very simple materials. It's a question of how you engage with them and how one understands them, that they can be sort of taken to another place, I hope and I believe. So this is just showing you the sort of the frame and the whole idea of transition. So it's basically a series of stairs that took you through the project. They did this, the sort of vertical movement through the house was not like in one vertical strip, but you actually meandered and walked through the spaces, engaging in the public spaces of the house, in a sense to meet your son, daughter, uncle, aunt, and then the bedrooms were sort of more privately arranged. And that's what we did, was we reoriented the house overlooking a park, which was a public park. And so they took advantage of that location. This is an interesting story. I mean, that gentleman there, we actually made the plaster. It's a lime plaster, and it was in March, and he had gone back to Rajasthan to get the marble dust, and he calls me back saying that, Sir G, we've got a problem. So I said, what happened? And he says, you know what, it just rained, in March in Rajasthan, where it never rains. And because of that, I can't identify the marble to make the marble dust. So he said it's going to take a couple of weeks and we'll have to wait for the marble to dry. And I was trying to figure out how am I going to tell the client, that it's raining in the middle of the desert and now we have to wait for the marble to dry so he can identify the right marble from which we can make the marble dust. But anyway, I thought, and we were just in hysterics, just to think about this idea. But that was the extent of, how these people engage and the sort of meticulousness in the way that they look at the materials. Again, here the whole idea was that there was a hole in the roof, there was a hole in the head, so to speak, of the house, and the idea that rain can enter, nature can physically enter into the project. And it's all about the question of care, engagement, attention that is required of the occupants. So that, if you're not so much alert, if you're not sensitive or if you're not engaged, the potential for that to take over, for that idea of this project, a ruin in a sense, but in a beautiful way, where insects, birds, plants, all of that eventually will finally engage with the project. And that's how it sits in a sort of urban setting. Two more projects, I think, and then this is a lodge, a traveler's lodge that we did up in the Himalayas. It was for the same client who was writing the book, with the two wooden boxes, and he had sort of had this crazy idea of wanting to, like the British, who traveled up in the mountains, have these tents, and they would sort of travel. He had a travel company, and want to set up camp and move with all this furniture that would fold up. But anyway, so he set up these tents on this site, that plateau there you see. And of course, in the first season, they had a problem. It was heavy snow, and these were tents for the desert, and it didn't even survive a season. So he said, can you go up and have a look? And so I did go up there, and I said, well, this is not going to work, but there's great potential because there's this wonderful place where there's a sort of continuity of building that has evolved through thousands of years, just dry stacks, and it's in abundance. And these are primarily farmers who build their own projects and build their own buildings. And so I suggested, why don't you lease the land from them? And maybe potentially we can, try and do something like that. I had no idea. I had no idea what it would cost, but I believed that, it had some potential. And so he went along with that. And in a sense, we wrote the software for the project. So we really sort of cleared the plateau, and the clearing was what was important. And then you can see the 4 rooms that are scattered on the different terraces of the site. But again, here the whole idea was that 50% of the project would be built locally and built in a short period of time when they're free, because in the winter time they can't farm, and that's when they actually they collect and they're resting, and that was the time they actually maintain and build their projects. So this is just a sort of atmosphere of the place. That's in winter time. And this is a slide we basically practiced in the studio. We didn't really have a specific agenda or plan. And we went to site and sat down, and over a period of 4 days actually drew the full project at full scale on site. And you can see they're in disagreement, not agreeing, and you have to sort of sit over a cup of tea and not make peace, but develop a relationship, saying that yes, that's the sort of opener, like you share something. And then we started building the project. But these were sort of important. So the whole drawing and the entire exercise was actually done on site. And the building was conceived because a lot of it had to be carried, 50%. The glass and the timber frame was actually carried. So we actually unitized it in a way that it could be hand carried. And you can see the pathways up. This was about 8,500 feet up in the mountains in the Himalayas. This is a recce of just the proximity of the material to the building. And I just wanted to show you because this is what we saw and observed when we went there several times. I think what was important again is it's all about proportion. And the moment we make it a bigger space or a different proportion, this entire integrity of the technology would be compromised. And this is something that we observed and learned. And we actually were lucky that the client was not sort of engaged in sort of a very intense way, that we were actually be able to make very compact rooms. Again, just this idea of yoga, I mean, it's insane these postures that they take, and they're able to build these, the way they're able to sort of put these projects together. So I think it's important, just this idea of postures and what that means to material and what that means to space and what that means to making. That's all embodied, I think, somewhere in the physical value of the space. And you can see just the sheer proximity of how women, men, the children were there. And it was all done in, I think, a period of 8 months, the entire project. What we also did was we used the people who built the project, they continued to maintain it, no different from the person, in a hotel who sort of polishes the brass railing. And these people go back and then tap the stone in place. And, so there's a sort of a day-to-day attention to the building and its nourishment. And it's a ritual in a sense that is practiced. It's been, I think, now 8 years. And they're still in very good shape. They're very simple buildings. They're no more than 10 feet by 17 feet rooms. And of course, the lifestyle here is different from the way the people live there, because most of the time they spend outdoors. So when they go back to their homes, they actually don't, they have a more protected enclosure. While people traveling to this place as visitors, it's very different. You want to sort of lie down and sort of take a sort of view of the entire surroundings from the inside. It's a sort of more, I would say, just a more contemporary lifestyle. So somewhere this idea of a hybrid between the two sort of cultural conditions. And farming, the sheep, all of that continues. All that continues through the different cycles of the season. Again, what was important in this was that it was a 10-year lease, and we had to dismantle the structure in 10 years. I think the client is now another 5 years. But we were not allowed to build anything in concrete or anything permanent. It all had to be lightweight and in such a way taken away once the lease had expired. So for me, this is an important big view of that. This was, of course, in the process of making. But this is how we imagine giving it back to them. And this idea of a hybrid where we stumbled across, in a way, I talked about storytelling, where we came across this settlement that had been abandoned and these walls were there. And it was this idea of continuity and sort of piggybacking on these walls. We built these new structures. Of course, it's a story, it's a fictional story, but in time, there's an ambiguity of what came first or what didn't. And that idea of, putting something in place, so there's a sort of core, intimate, archetypal sense that exists in these places. And for me, this image is very important, that sort of conveys this story in the way that we actually constructed the site. This is the last project. It's a house we've recently completed, and what's important here again is this whole idea of the well that makes the foundation of the house. It's the beginning of life, and in a sense. And this was done, in early March of 2010. Water diviner with the coconut sort of walks around, and then at one point he stands there and says, "This is the point," and one wonders. And we've been accurate 9 times out of 10. There's no scientific sort of measurement, and this idea of water diviner, divinity, to this sort of perception or sensitivity to the ground. And so anyway, this had to be constructed in a month and a half. And what we did was use the soil as a backfill, which you can see here in the section also. In the two clearings that were there, it was a paddy field, and that was the only place we could build. So we actually, through a distance of 100 meters, moved the soil and then used monsoon to basically compact the earth. Again, this area floods in the monsoon, so we needed to create a high ground, and you can see in the section that it's slightly more elevated than the rest of the existing ground. And what we were able to do in the process was allow for the ground and the water that would be used to sustain the house. So the well really becomes a sort of very integral, important part of the first mark that is made. Again, this idea of adjusting soil, because we didn't get any trucks, so there's a balance that is shifted physically on site, and so there's a sort of, in a way, to maintain an equilibrium that, you know, when you displace the status quo of the site, that there's a new equilibrium that is set in this displacement. So anyway, I'm showing you, just the process of how that is a line out. There's that little model that you see in the foreground, and we check it and we adjust it, and you know, it's like a dance again. You have to sort of, you know, figure out what's the optimum. And we like doing this only because there's at a certain point you find that it resonates at the right point. You know, it's not about 1 feet or 2 feet or 1 foot 6 inches. It could be 1.65 or 1.55. But it's the gap in between that's actually more important, and that's when we know it's right. So this is just exercise, and you can see that's the clearing, that's the house. It's a courtyard house, and the whole idea of the courtyard was to release the anxiety of the site, or the anxiety of the ground, because this floods in the monsoon, and it's sort of cutting a hole on a slab, so it sort of releases the water. Of course, it's higher up. And also this idea of holding the anxiety of the site, because it's quite dense, you know, with mango trees, and with the monsoons, you can actually hear the trees grow. They sort of come crawling at, you know, they come at you. You know, light is darker, it can sense to be claustrophobic. So this idea of this aperture in the middle, that is a space that actually is a place to hold the anxiety of the site, to hold the anxiety of the people, the quality of the drawings of these carpenters over a period of time. Some of them have measurements, some don't. But just this is a working drawing. So they have about 20 sketchbooks on this particular project. Again, you know, local inspiration, osmosis, structures very similar that I've seen here in Sri Lanka, and even driving down to Gaul. Many pictures that one has taken. So I think, where do these ideas come from? Where do memories lie? You know, they're all important, very important sort of ideas in thinking about what makes us create the things that we do. And I would say it's more like a monsoon house. It's a house for the rains, because the moment the rains come in, it sort of dissolves or dissipates. The whole house sort of, in a sense, dissolves into the water. And this courtyard really is what absorbs this season, I think. This was in construction anyway. Again, here the tolerances are very tight, so that the space between outside and inside is only separated by 7 inches, and you would wonder how do you manage this in the monsoon. But it's all a question of calibration. It's like the way we wear a raincoat or put you know, the hood on our head, and it's a question of it's not about being uncomfortable or comfortable, but about being attentive to the climatic seasons, how to negotiate them, and what window do you keep open and which one do you keep closed, and how do you adjust it. All that becomes part and parcel of this sort of living entity, you know, the human and the architecture that sort of forms an envelope. Again, this rock was very recently put in as a sense of actually absorbing and holding the water, sort of keeping the water pressed down. And it's a sort of an odd condition, because the stone would actually sink in water, but that's the suggestion of this rock that actually holds this entire project, holds the entire space, holds the entire, you know, surroundings that wrap it. Again, the idea of this taking reflected light rather than direct light. It's much softer, you keep the heat out. And there's a certain quality of illumination that one gets from that. Very much in Kerala architecture, that they would actually take light through reflection, through the reflected sort of space between the eaves and the floor. And floors would normally be highly polished to sort of draw that light in and actually keep the heat out. And we've tried to sort of emulate and learn from these exercises of what we've observed. This house is, the top of the house is wrapped in copper, and sometime, I guess, in the next several years, it will basically patina into this, and like a camouflage, sit in the landscape. And that's again this idea of taking care of the ground. This is, I think, I didn't talk about it, but we normally sweep the site, and this idea of sweeping the site is not just about keeping it clean, but actually becoming familiar. I think both our landscapes are, we have insects and poisonous snakes, and so it's a way that traditionally that's how they would manage with very limited means, without being actually overwhelmed by the landscape. So this idea of sweeping that I find quite interesting, it's a sort of caressing or taking care of the ground. So I just like this idea of when we go to site, we actually, first thing we do is we sweep the floor, and this practice is continued till the site is completed, and it continues even after the site is made. And it's just a way of being familiar with what you walk on. Even though there might not be anything, it's just this very sort of intimate relationship. I showed this slide just with the idea of a moment in time where this idea of slowness and what that means, and that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bijoy, for that wonderful exposition of your work. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them in the next 10 minutes. So if there's any questions, please, I'm sure Bijoy will be willing to answer them. If not, we'll meet over a cup of tea outside and then we could speak with him. Are there any questions that you might like to ask? Yes, Ismat.
Do you think that as people get more literate, they lose their sense of artistic skill? Do you think that as
The question is, do you think that when people get more literate, would they lose their artistic skills? Is that right?
yeah?
Well, I think that is true of any of us. Every time you gain knowledge or insight, and this I speak, also personally for myself, is how do you continuously reconfigure yourself? Because at some point that then creates a status quo. So yes, it's an interesting question that oftentimes as they learn, there's a sense of a plateau. And the whole idea is how do you keep breaking this plateau, breaking the status quo? But I think that is universal. It's not anything to do with the artisans, it's got to do with all of us. And it's that, how do you tweak the dial, how do you reconfigure? And again, that all comes to, as much, how do I unlearn what I've learned? I think has to remain sort of fundamental in this entire process. And part of this we're able to do with the things that we make, because it requires you to be tactile, and it's not just an intellectual exercise. And so that's what actually keeps this process of continuity of learning alive. And that's the best way I could possibly address this question.